Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day 16 of the Bible in 365. Today we're taking a look at Genesis chapter 45, beginning in verse 16, and reading all the way until Genesis chapter 48, ending in verse 7. Let's get started. So our story continues in chapter 45, beginning in verse 16. Here we learn that news got out to Pharaoh of Joseph's brother's presence in Egypt. Pharaoh is actually pleased by this news, and he tells Joseph, hey, tell your family to move here. Send them home with the best of supplies, send them with carts and everything that they would need to make the journey back to Egypt. And so that's what Joseph does. He sends his brothers off, and his brothers arrive in Canaan, and they tell their father Jacob, now known as Israel, about this entire ordeal. And at first he doesn't believe them, and he's like, what do you mean? But then he takes a look at the bounty and all the supplies that they brought in with him, and he says, surely my son is alive. I will see him before I die. And so our story continues in chapter 46. Israel and his entire family is now packed up, and they're making the journey towards Egypt. They stop in Beersheba. Here we know that the Lord has appeared to Israel several times. He does appear to Israel once again, and he tells him, Jacob, Jacob, I am the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will be with you, and I will bring you back again. In Joseph's own hand will close your eyes. In other words, go down there. My promise still stands. Your descendants are going to grow. And I'm keeping my covenant with you. When the time's right, your family will move back, and you're going to spend the rest of your life there, but you will see your son Joseph again. So Jacob and the entire clan of Joseph's family heads out. Here in verses 7 through 25, it gives us a bit of a genealogy regarding Jacob and regarding this whole entourage that is moving down to Egypt. And it tells us that there were 66 persons, but including Joseph, his wife, and his two sons, there was 70 in total. So the family was 70 people that would now eventually settle in Egypt, in particular in the land of Goshen, or the region of Goshen. Now, at the end of chapter 46 and into 47, it tells us that Joseph instructs his family members, his brothers, to tell Pharaoh that they are shepherds. That way they could settle in the land of Goshen, because the Egyptians didn't like to mingle with shepherds. They wanted to have nothing to do with them. And so Pharaoh permits this. He allows them to look over their flocks in the land of Goshen, gives them the best land there, and says, hey, if any of you are highly skilled, let him actually look over my livestock as well. So Pharaoh essentially blesses Joseph and his family and says it's all right for them to stay there in the land, that he will protect them. He will give them the best of the land. Now it is here in the middle of chapter 47 that we learn that the famine has grown worse. At this point in time, people have ran out of food, they've ran out of money, and they still need food. So they come to Joseph and they say, hey, we need food, but we have no way to pay you. And so Joseph says, well, sell me your livestock in exchange for food. And so they sell them their livestock. And then some time passes, and they say, hey, we have no more food and we have no livestock to sell you. And so Joseph says, well, sell us your land. And so they sell their land in exchange for food. And so through all of this, Joseph acquires for Pharaoh all of the land of Egypt, except for that which was dedicated to the priests of Egypt, because they had a special allowance that was given to them by Pharaoh. At the end of chapter 47, it tells us some sobering news. It tells us that Jacob had lived in Egypt for 17 years, and at this point he's 147 years old. He knows that he's getting older and that he might not live much longer, so he calls Joseph to his side and makes a promise with him. And he essentially makes Joseph promise that his bones will not be buried in Egypt, but rather with those of his father and his grandfather, his ancestors. And so Joseph says that he will do what he said, and he swears upon that. So at the beginning of chapter 48, it tells us that Joseph's father Israel has fallen ill, and so Joseph and his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, make the journey to visit Israel before he dies. At this point in time, Israel summons all his strength, sits up, and then he tells Joseph the story of the blessing of God and God's sovereignty upon his life, and ultimately the covenant that God made with him to multiply his descendants and to make him a great name, and that this was an everlasting promise. And so we see that it is a very important to Israel to pass this on to Joseph and his descendants. It is here in verse 7 that we end our reading for tonight. So tomorrow we will continue reading in Genesis. We'll take a look at Genesis 48:8 all the way to the end of the book, Genesis 50, ending in verse 26. And then we're also going to take a look at Exodus chapter 1. As always, folks, God bless.